Hi everyone, I'm Claire van der Westhuizen, and in this video I will be focusing on randomized controlled trials, the gold standard for testing interventions. To give some context, studies can generally be divided into two types, observational and experimental. Experimental studies are further grouped into quasi-experimental designs and randomized controlled trials, often referred to as RCTs. In this video, we'll be focusing on RCTs. When planning for or critically evaluating an RCT, there are a few key features that need to be considered. Let's start with the purpose of RCTs. RCTs are commonly used to see if an intervention, like a treatment or prevention program, actually works. They are considered the gold standard when testing the effectiveness of interventions. This is because they can minimize the influence of potential biases and confounders. RCTs are experimental, meaning that researchers actively manipulate variables or intervene in some way. Typically, they are longitudinal, meaning they collect data at multiple time points. This could be, for example, before an intervention is delivered and after. RCTs have high internal validity. In other words, they're designed to demonstrate that a change in the dependent or outcome variable is caused by the independent variable, the intervention. Researchers do this by first randomly assigning participants to either an intervention group or a control group. This is what we call manipulating the independent variable. Then we can confidently say that the results were caused by the intervention and not by other factors. Next, let's look at appropriate research questions for RCTs. Examples include, is an emotional regulation program effective in reducing symptoms of depression among adolescents? We can also ask, does a 12-week cognitive behavioral therapy intervention significantly reduce anxiety symptoms in adults compared to a control group receiving no intervention? You will notice I used the term effectiveness in the first example and mentioned significantly reducing anxiety symptoms in the other. Key feature number 3 focuses on the sampling method. The sampling method in an RCT influences how well the study represents the target population and whether there are biases in participant selection. Different sampling methods impact the study's external validity or generalizability in various ways. For instance, random sampling typically enhances external validity by providing a more representative sample, while stratified sampling ensures that key subgroups within the population are adequately represented. Conversely, convenience sampling often results in lower external validity, potentially limiting the applicability of the findings to a broader population. It's important to note that the sampling method differs significantly from the random assignment of participants to groups, which is also an important feature of an RCT. A random sampling method increases the external validity of a study, while random allocation or assignment to groups impacts on the internal validity. Sample size in RCTs is also important to consider for several reasons. First, a larger sample size increases the statistical power, meaning the likelihood of detecting an effect or difference between groups increases, if there is actually an effect. In RCTs, small sample sizes may lead to underpowered studies, where real differences or effects go undetected. Essentially, having a large sample helps to minimize the chances of type 1 and type 2 errors that can occur when we test hypotheses. In RCTs, a larger sample also helps ensure that the randomization process distributes potential confounding variables between groups equally, thereby reducing bias. Finally, a larger sample size can increase the generalizability of the findings. A well-powered sample that is more representative of the population improves the chances that the results will apply to other settings beyond the current study setting. Before we go into the study details of an RCT in public mental health, it's important to zoom in on the independent variable, particularly given that these studies usually focus on testing and intervention. This is key feature number 4 of an RCT. The independent variable is the factor that researchers deliberately manipulate to observe its effect on the dependent variable or outcome. It's crucial that the independent variable is clearly defined. We need to know exactly what the intervention group are exposed to and also the control group. When considering the independent variable later in our analysis and interpretation of the findings, it's also important to investigate intervention retention. If an intervention is an 8-session school-based intervention, we would like to retain as many participants as possible for all 8 sessions. In reality, some participants may only complete 6 or 7 sessions, so we wouldn't have 100% retention in the intervention. It is vital to know the dose or how many sessions the participants actually received. The 5th key feature of an RCT is crucial: randomization. Essentially, randomization involves the random assignment or allocation of participants to the control and intervention groups. This ensures both groups are similar in all respects, except for the treatment received. By random allocation to the control or intervention group, we mean that allocation is determined by chance. Good randomization ensures that all participants have exactly the same chance of allocation to the treatment or control group. The allocation to groups cannot be predicted or influenced by the researchers or the participants. The actual randomization of each participant is best done off-site, especially not by the investigator or research team member in the field. For example, a team member might contact a central office to find out a participant's group allocation once the person has been recruited for the study. There are several different types of randomization methods. There is simple randomization, such as tossing a coin, or generating random numbers using a computer program to assign participants to groups. This method is less popular than it used to be, given it can lead to group imbalances. A more effective method is block randomization, involving dividing participants into small balanced groups or blocks with a predetermined number of participants. The participants within each block are then randomly assigned to the treatment or control groups. This technique ensures that the number of subjects in each treatment group or control group remains similar throughout the study. Another approach, called minimization, addresses the issue of imbalance by calculating the distribution of specific factors such as age or severity of symptoms among participants. Minimization assesses the current imbalances across these factors during recruitment to ensure that the overall distribution remains as balanced as possible. Lastly, stratified randomization ensures that potential confounding factors are distributed more evenly between groups than would occur by chance alone. For instance, researchers might stratify by age or location, ensuring that each group has a similar composition regarding these characteristics. This helps enhance the validity of the study by controlling for potential biases related to those characteristics. Essentially, randomization limits threats to internal validity by creating equivalent groups, which reduces biases and controls for confounders. This allows researchers to confidently attribute any differences in outcomes to the intervention itself. Let's use a practical example of an RCT that is testing the effectiveness of a school-based social-emotional learning intervention for symptoms of depression and anxiety. I'll mention some threats to internal validity and describe how randomization works to reduce these threats. Let's start with history. History as a threat to internal validity refers to external events occurring during the study. These events could influence participants' anxiety levels independently of the intervention. But because investigators randomly assign participants to treatment and control groups, both groups should have roughly the same exposure to these external events. Any changes in anxiety due to outside events should theoretically affect both groups equally. This isolates the intervention as the key variable influencing participant outcomes. Maturation occurs when participants' symptoms, skills, or characteristics naturally develop and change over time. For example, students might naturally outgrow anxiety as they progress in school. Since maturation affects both the control and intervention groups, randomization ensures that any natural changes in anxiety are accounted for and balanced between groups. Any differences observed between groups can be attributed to the intervention itself more confidently. Next, testing effects are a threat to internal validity, given repeated testing can influence outcomes. For example, students may perform better or feel more comfortable with anxiety assessments because they complete them at multiple time points. But in an RCT, both groups experience repeated testing, helping to control for this effect. Again, any change in the treatment group beyond that seen in the control group would likely result from the intervention, and not simply from repeated testing. Selection bias is another potential threat to internal validity. Differences between groups at the outset can lead to skewed results, making it unclear whether the intervention or pre-existing group differences caused the observed changes. But randomization minimizes selection bias by ensuring that participants in both the treatment and control groups are similar in all relevant aspects at the start of the study. Again, this helps isolate the intervention as the key cause of any differences observed. Moving on to regression to the mean. This threat to internal validity appears when extreme scores, such as very high anxiety, tend to move toward the average over time. This can be mistaken for improvement due to the intervention, but randomization reduces the likelihood that extreme cases will be concentrated in one group. Since both groups should have similar ranges of anxiety at the start of the RCT, any regression to the mean will affect both groups. This allows for more accurate measurement of the intervention's effect. The only threat to internal validity that is not limited to randomization is mortality or attrition. This refers to participants dropping out of the study, which can lead to biased results. This is especially problematic if dropouts are related to the intervention. For example, those with higher anxiety might be more likely to avoid attending the intervention sessions. They may not want to think about anxiety for fear that this may increase their anxiety. Consideration number 6 is being aware of the types of RCTs. Although there are many types of RCTs, this video will focus on individually randomized RCTs and cluster randomized RCTs. An individually randomized RCT is when individual participants are randomly assigned to either the intervention group or the control group. Each participant's assignment is independent, meaning that the randomization process determines whether each person receives the treatment or not. This design helps ensure that the groups are comparable, reducing bias and allowing researchers to confidently assess the effects of the intervention. A cluster randomized controlled trial, or cluster RCT, involves randomizing entire groups or clusters of participants rather than individual participants. Clusters can be defined in various ways, such as schools, clinics, or communities. In this design, all members of a cluster are exposed to the intervention group or to the control condition. Cluster RCTs are especially valuable when randomizing individuals is impractical. This type of RCT may also be attractive as it more closely resembles real-world intervention rollout than individually randomized trials do. Let's go back to an example of an intervention in school to reduce depression and anxiety. We have our intervention, and now we want to test its effectiveness. So which RCT type would work best? At first, we might consider an individually randomized trial to test our intervention. Here, we will randomly select individuals to go into the intervention arm that receives our intervention or the control arm that receives treatment as usual. We then collect data on each individual in each arm before and after the intervention and compare their scores. This type of RCT is very common. But if we deliver our intervention in a school setting, is an individually randomized RCT going to be appropriate? In the same school, some kids will be in the intervention arm of the study, and some kids will be in the control arm. This might pose some issues to us. So let's get back to the question, which RCT type would work best? In this instance, we might consider doing a cluster RCT. In a cluster RCT, we are not allocating individuals to intervention arms, but rather allocating whole schools to either an intervention or control arm. And the reason we might prefer a cluster RCT here rather than an individual RCT is because we are concerned about contamination. Contamination may occur in an individual RCT when a learner in the intervention arm shares what they learned with a learner in the control arm. This means that some of those learners in the control arm actually receive a dose of the intervention. The seventh key feature of an RCT is data collection. Data in RCTs are collected through methods such as questionnaires, interviews, or observations. Participants are asked about their conditions, behaviors, or other characteristics. RCTs are able to assess multiple variables at the same time. These can be demographic, social, behavioral, or health-related variables depending on the study's focus. There is usually a primary outcome variable and several secondary outcomes. RCTs are usually very clear upfront what their primary outcome of interest is. Data in RCTs are typically collected at multiple time points, making them longitudinal studies. The timing of follow-ups helps determine how long the effects of the intervention last. For example, if an intervention reduces symptoms of anxiety at the 12-month follow-up, we cannot assume that the effect will still be present 2 or 3 years later. So we have put careful effort into the sampling and sample size calculations for an RCT, successfully randomized participants to groups, and of course delivered the intervention. We need to avoid attrition for study follow-up assessments, given the longitudinal design. Researchers spend a good amount of their time putting strategies in place to ensure that they're able to conduct follow-up assessments. Some studies will conduct follow-up at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and even longer after the intervention. Loss to follow-up can be a huge problem in these studies, so we really do expend a lot of effort here. Blinding, also known as masking in RCTs, is a technique used to reduce bias. This is done by preventing participants, researchers, or both from knowing a participant's group allocation. There are different levels of blinding. In a single blind RCT, only the researchers collecting the data are unaware of whether the participants are receiving the intervention or not. This helps prevent researchers' expectations from influencing the outcomes. On the other hand, in a double-blind RCT, both the participants and the researchers are unaware of which group each participant is in. This further reduces bias, as neither the participants nor the researchers can influence the results based on knowledge of group assignments. It's important to be aware that it's simply not feasible for all RCTs that test interventions to be double-blinded, particularly psychological interventions. This is because participants will know if they're receiving cognitive behavioral therapy. You can't blind them to this. Therefore, only single-blinded RCTs are used in this kind of research. Another important feature to pay attention to is how the variables are measured in RCTs. Measures included in RCTs, particularly for the primary outcome, should be reliable and valid in the setting that they are used. This means that they need to have good psychometric properties. Psychometric properties refer to the characteristics of a measure, such as reliability and validity. Reliability refers to the consistency and stability of the measure, while validity refers to the extent to which a measure accurately captures the construct it is intended to measure. We also need to look at strict guidelines for registering and reporting RCTs. Before an RCT even starts, the researchers need to register the trials in databases like clinicaltrials.gov or the WHO International Clinical Trials Registry platform. Registration ensures that the study's details, such as objectives, interventions, and outcomes, are available to the public, improving the credibility of the research. The Equator Network site is very helpful when it comes to identifying appropriate reporting guidelines, as you can see from this list. Equator stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. You may also find other guidelines as you search the academic literature. The reporting guidelines most often used for RCTs is the CONSORT guidelines. Putting all of this information together, we can identify several strengths of RCTs. First, RCTs can show cause and effect as they have high internal validity. They are the gold standard for determining cause and effect relationships. Random assignment ensures that differences between groups can be attributed to the intervention rather than other factors. Second, a major strength of RCTs is their ability to collect data on multiple outcomes. This means that in addition to testing the primary effect of an intervention, researchers can also gather data on various secondary outcomes. This comprehensive data collection allows for a more complete understanding of the intervention's overall impact. This makes RCTs particularly valuable for assessing both intended and unintended effects across different aspects of participants' well-being. Third, a strength of RCTs is their adherence to strict reporting guidelines, such as CONSORT. These guidelines ensure that RCTs are transparently and comprehensively reported, including details on methodology, participant flow, randomization methods, and outcomes. Finally, a key strength of RCTs is that their findings can be easily synthesized into systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Because RCTs follow rigorous and standardized methodologies, their results are highly comparable across different studies. This allows researchers to combine data from multiple RCTs to draw broader conclusions about the effectiveness of an intervention. However, there are also some major limitations of these studies. One significant limitation of RCTs is their high cost. Conducting an RCT requires substantial financial resources due to various factors, including the need for extensive participant recruitment, rigorous training for research staff, comprehensive data collection and follow-up, as we've mentioned, as well as analysis. RCTs are also very time-consuming. The process of designing and implementing an RCT involves multiple phases, including developing a detailed protocol, obtaining necessary approvals, and recruiting participants. All of these steps can take considerable time. Ensuring that eligibility criteria are met and achieving a sufficient sample size further adds to this timeline. Moreover, RCTs often require long follow-up periods to thoroughly evaluate the effects of an intervention, further extending the study duration. This lengthy process can delay the availability of results. RCTs are logistically complex with many moving parts. Conducting an RCT requires careful planning and coordination among various components, including recruitment and randomization procedures, delivery, data collection. Each of these elements must be managed efficiently to ensure the study runs smoothly. This complexity can lead to challenges in maintaining protocol adherence, managing timelines, as we've mentioned, and ensuring data integrity. Finally, RCTs can have limited generalizability. The controlled environment of an RCT may not reflect real-world conditions. As a result, the findings may not apply to broader, more diverse populations. Essentially, they tend to have low external validity. I hope you found this video helpful in understanding the key features of an RCT. As a reminder, here is a list of 10 things to consider when planning or assessing an experimental study. Thank you for listening.